Well, here we go again. WhatIfAltHist has released another zany hour-long video titled The Coming Far-Right Backlash. Basically, it's about how modern-day leftists are fanning the flames of the radical right who will soon seize power in America. A lot of what he says is just factually false, completely untrue. A lot of the other stuff he says is far-right gibberish. The guy literally denies that different ethnic groups are equal. Those are his words, and they might be a dog whistle, or maybe he just forgot what the word equal means, but come on. And his citations are filled with Nazis and racists. Not like edgy people, but actual National Socialists. We'll get more into that later, but this is what happens when you surround yourself with people who just blindly agree with you politically and with anything else you say. You lose track of rationality. I remember the days when WhatIfAltHist used to talk about alternate history. Now he's fallen into the conservative debate bro pipeline quicker than your cousins from flyover country. No offense if that describes your family or you, because a lot of people have watched that video so far, and a lot more will. So I'm gonna go through his worst claims, point by point, and disprove them not using, left-wing dogma or whatever, but pure old facts and logic. If you liked his video, hear me out. It's good to hear people you disagree with. If you disagree with WhatIfAltHist in the first place, then why don't you hear me out too, since the guy's not going anywhere, and more people than just me need to press back against his claims. Comment if you think I said something dumb too. Okay, so he starts off with an introduction which discusses his premise.
The history of the world moves by pendulum. There is progress, which is why we aren't giant toads living in salty tidal pools anymore, but it's nowhere near to a straight path. With countless ups, downs, and countervening directions, history does move in a direction, but I can swear that it's not one that you, or even I, can really understand. One of the modern left's favorite phrases is that they are on the right side of history. However, what if I were to tell you that that wasn't true, that the next 2 decades belong to the very opposite group, the far right? From looking at the patterns in history and trends, I believe that the pendulum will swing back in the other direction for the next few decades. Although I myself am a right-winger, it would be a lie for me to say I'm not terrified for how far the pendulum might go in the other direction. For many of you, this will shatter your conception of the universe, and I'm excited to see what the comments are for this video. Well, why are we wasting time? Let's get started.
Okay, this is fine. I'll give him credit. If you look at the course of history, a lot of what happens could be described using the metaphor of a pendulum. Just for a brief example, let's look at the United States over the course of the 1900s. First you had the progressives, then the conservatives, then the progressives, then the moderates, then conservatives, then moderates, and so on back and forth. You could also theoretically argue that a pendulum isn't just swinging back and forth, but history is also heading down a river. Today's conservatives, for example, are a lot more moderate than conservatives of 1923 on a lot of things, including key issues like interracial marriage. WhatIfAltHist talks about this in his video, but if you want to get a big enough pendulum swing so that a huge part of the country goes back to the ideas of 1923, then you need a huge impetus, like a global war, a complete economic depression, government collapse, that sort of thing. Only a major crisis could reverse the flow of the river. So the frame narrative of the video, it's fine. It's the details that are the actual issue. What does he say next?
We're all strangers to the world we live in. That's since we're so familiar with our current time that we have no frame of reference for what's strange, wrong, and all that since we don't know what makes us special. We're fish in a pond that have never seen the outside world, and even more so, the bodies of those fish are mostly made up of water of the pond they live in the same way we make up and cannot be separated from the era of history we live in, the culture we live in, and all that. Thus, it's incredibly funny to see the left portray itself as the rebels and the little guy. Well, in fact, they are the ruling class today. In the modern West, the left is the establishment. You can easily see this in that Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, and Donald Trump have all had legal action taken against them, while there's no left-wing equivalent.
Let's talk about those claims. It's ironic that WhatIfAltHist says that we have as little perspective as fish in a pond when he immediately plunges into claims which have no perspective. Let's go point by point through those guys that he just mentioned. And I know he just mentioned them maybe in passing, but he talks about them more later on, and it's one of the cornerstones of the premise of the video. First is Jordan Peterson, the world-famous Canadian conservative. Peterson has not been a victim of any actual major lawsuit. In fact, if you Google Jordan Peterson lawsuit, you're just going to find him suing people who criticized him. He wasn't fired from the University of Toronto, he quit. He hasn't been cancelled. He's famous and very wealthy for basically writing generic self-help books, which basically just copy Joseph Campbell's A Hero with a Thousand Faces. The number one thing that Jordan Peterson likes to play a victim about is Bill C-16, a 2017 Canadian law which made it a crime to deny services to or promote genocide of people on the basis of their gender identity, i.e. transgender people. Peterson's main fear is that calling transgender people a pronoun they don't use would result in legal punishment. He even threatened to go on hunger strike if he got locked up on that basis. The bill does not provide for legal punishment for using the wrong pronoun. No actual legal scholar has argued that calling people the wrong pronoun rises to the standards of the bill. As evidence for this, Jordan Peterson's not in jail. The worst consequences he's ever faced is getting his Twitter account suspended for a little bit for harassing Elliot Page. In fact, Peterson's more popular than ever, despite his best efforts to wither away by only eating meat. Next is Andrew Tate, a failed kickboxer turned misogynist influencer turned sex trafficker. Tate didn't face any legal punishment for being conservative. He's on trial because of sex trafficking. He has literally described the tactics of his sex trafficking operation to the public. He was arrested not in the United States, but in Romania, one of the most conservative countries in Europe. There's no conspiracy here. It's literally just a grifter getting arrested for what people should be arrested for doing. Harvey Weinstein, a major donor to the Democratic Party, did a similar crime and is now in prison. Jeffrey Epstein did the same thing. Back in 2007, by the way, Epstein was almost locked away for a long time, if not for U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta giving him a lenient deal. Epstein later got sent back to prison and then definitely killed himself. Acosta served in the Trump administration as the U.S. Secretary of Labor, a cabinet-level position. Donald Trump has faced consequences, not for being a conservative, but for breaking the law. He is currently on trial for cooking his books to cover up paying a bribe to a porn actress. He also may face legal consequences for riling up a mob to storm the U.S. Capitol, or perhaps telling the Georgia Secretary of State to generate him the votes he needed to win the state. This is where the party of Lincoln has gone. Okay, 2 additional points. One is addressed to conservative people. Don't let yourself be defined by these grifters. Peterson's not a criminal, at least, but Tate and Trump definitely are. Both Trump and Tate are wackos and crooks who have nothing between their ears but narcissism and Neanderthal instincts. They are using you to enrich themselves and leave you with nothing left. You guys need to find the next Thomas Jefferson or James Madison. You need to find honorable, honest, and respectable people to lead your cause if you want to get anything productive done. Don't be lemmings. The agency is in your hands. Second, the whole argument is based upon the premise of equivalency, that Democrats commit the same crimes that Republicans do, but only Republicans suffer for it. If this was the case, where were the hordes of Antifa stormtroopers breaking into the U.S. Capitol building with guns and handcuffs in January 2017 to stop Trump's rise to power? Where are the bribes issued by Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama? The greatest crime ever sicked on Clinton was improper handling of classified materials, which Donald Trump has done as well. Surely President Trump would have arrested Hillary Clinton, a campaign promise, if there was any legal basis to do so. Now, I'm not going to die on the hill of defending thick-walleted Democratic politicians. If they've done something wrong, which some have, then they deserve to face consequences, just as Republican politicians deserve to face consequences when they do something wrong. There just isn't an equivalency here between Trump and Democratic politicians. Okay, moving on.
In my own story, YouTube has removed my videos on completely innocuous educational topics like American regional cultures or Southeast Asian anthropology, without telling me why. The conservative satire site The Babylon Bee has this really funny segment about how A very large amount of American conservative leaders have been kicked off Twitter, but at the same time, people like Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, lots of officials for the Chinese Communist Party, which is committing genocide, as well as even Vladimir Putin's Russian government Twitter account have maintained, showing a clear ideological bias.
Okay, first, that hiss at the end was him, not me. There's other editing issues throughout his video, but you know what, I'm not going to focus on them, so okay. The two videos he's talking about are back on YouTube, but, you know, I get his point. His claims have some merit, but it's a lot more complicated than how he paints it. First, YouTube blocks content not because it's conservative, but on the basis of it being political, discussing controversial topics, or being, you know, outright honest hate speech. Leftist content has also been removed or demonetized on the basis of those first two categories. It's not a left versus right issue, but a top versus down issue. Obviously, I don't think YouTube should do all of this, except for maybe, you know, hate speech. Besides that, it's a dumb and harmful policy. But why do they do it? Well, YouTube is a corporation. Their advertisers don't want their business ads to be placed next to controversial political topics, which is ironic because they have no problem placing ads next to people being butchered in Game of Thrones or Marco Rubio being butchered on national television. Corporations, in the end, don't vote for blue or for red, they vote for green, money. They will do whatever they can, legal or illegal if the fines aren't big enough, to maximize their profits. YouTube and its advertisers aren't leftist, they're capitalist. Let's talk about Twitter for a second. I'm not going to die on the hill of defending Twitter, but if you look at who's been removed, it's people who deserve to be removed for the most part. We'll talk about Trump in a second, but the majority of conservative leaders, like WhatIfAltHist claims, have not been removed from Twitter. That's a ridiculous and false claim. It's just not true. The most prominent conservative people besides Trump who've been banned are grifters and freaks like Alex Jones, Milo Yiannopoulos, and Mike Lindell, who WhatIfAltHist condemns later on himself. The internet is a better off place without these people spewing fetid trash on the face of the American public. The same goes for Donald Trump, who was not banned because he was conservative, but because he attempted to undo a democratic election by lying, pressuring civil servants, and riling up a mob. If Donald Trump was a Democrat, he'd be banned too, but he's not. Okay, but why are Putin, communist Chinese officials, and Khamenei still on Twitter? Okay, first, Putin doesn't have a Twitter account. The Russian presidential office does, just as the US presidential office does as well. The latter wasn't banned after January 6th. In any case, the Russian presidential account was banned, alongside others, when Russia invaded Ukraine. Those bans are being undone by Elon Musk, a conservative who reinstated Trump as well. Khamenei has also had tweets removed, as well as Chinese Communist Party officials. Maybe, this is a possibility, maybe Twitter should outright ban the accounts of cruel countries. I wouldn't really mind that. It's worth pointing out, though, that Twitter is already banned itself in Russia, Iran, and China, so banning those Twitter accounts won't actually change anything in those countries. So if you look at the facts, Twitter and YouTube don't censor conservatives on the basis of being conservative, but for other reasons. Okay, moving on.
The dominant social institutions of academia, the media, Hollywood, most of the news, the bureaucracy, large parts of social media, growing parts of the military, the largest corporations and defense contractors, significant parts of religious institutions, in the United States, the presidency, and large parts of the legislature are run by left-wingers, and often very radical ones at that. Although the right occasionally wins elections, the left runs every major institution in society. The quote-unquote rebels and oppressed now run society. As befits an old entrenched elite, they crack down on dissent and try to spread their ideology. They have tried to turn every movie, TV show, all art, classes in school and university, and every other output for human thought into their propaganda. If you can't see this already, you don't want to see it, or you're old enough to be detached from the main part of the society. As said before, they silence those that disagree with them and have ever-increasing standards of purity used to instill fanaticism in their ranks.
Obviously, it's a ridiculous and pretty dumb idea that leftists control all aspects of American society. If that was the case, Donald Trump would never have been elected in the first place, right? We'd have a $25 minimum wage nationwide, and Roe v. Wade would still be around. You can't have leftists control all aspects of American society, but also being so incompetent that they lose power to the GOP every few years and can't actually get anything done. First, let's talk about the media. You could conceivably argue that there are more cable news networks that lean to the left, but they're balanced out by Fox News, which obviously leans to the right and has a greater primetime viewership audience than the rest. There's a reason, in the end, why people are floating Tucker Carlson to be a presidential candidate and not somebody from CNN. It's also true that universities in this country are liberal. It appears that the more you read and the more you learn about the world, the less conservative you are. But while colleges as a whole might be pretty left-wing, you also have to consider the fact that young people in general are already more left-wing. Perhaps that's because the only party which is making efforts to help college graduates and young people in general are the Democrats, while the other party is trying to press them deeper into the debt trap they've been thrown into. As age goes up, in the end though, the more moderate you become. If you look at the statistics, people with bachelor's degrees voted 47% for Donald Trump in 2020, which is the national average. It's true that people with postgraduate degrees just voted for him 37%, but they make up 15% of the vote, which is less than people without any college education. How about Hollywood? It's true that Hollywood production companies like Disney donate to Democratic politicians. Well, technically it's people who work for those companies, but, the point maybe still stands. But they're not donating to, actual leftists. They're donating to the literal DNC, which is center-left to moderate at the farthest, or candidates like Catherine Cortez Masto or Val Demings, who aren't crazy radicals. As for Hollywood producing leftist propaganda, that's just not true. The biggest movie in the past 10 years was Avengers Endgame, which, featured a Scandinavian guy, a billionaire, and literally Captain America fighting against, an eco-terrorist person of color. The other two biggest movies ever were the Avatar movies, which are just Lawrence of Arabia clones with blue people. Was Lawrence of Arabia leftist propaganda? When conservatives talk about Hollywood propaganda, they literally just mean movies that have women, black people, or transgender people just around doing anything. Only one of the top 10 movies Hollywood has ever made has a woman as the main character. Just because movies have more women or minorities in them than the 1950s doesn't mean that Hollywood is brainwashing people. It's not propaganda, it's literally just a mirror of the way the world really is. This whole Hollywood propaganda conspiracy is the same old recycled Red Scare McCarthyist witch hunt from the 1950s. How about the rest of what WhatIfAltHist says? Well, it's completely and utterly bogus. First, let's establish the actual, literal centers of power in America. Like who actually controls the way we live materially. First, of course, obviously is the government. The President of the United States is a moderate to center-left, radical old, geriatric politician. He's been around for decades. He's not a radical. I don't see how you could possibly get a far-right backlash to Joe Biden. 2 years ago, the president was conservative. 2 years from now, the president will again be a conservative, and so on. That's the pendulum WhatIfAltHist described 5 minutes ago, but has since forgotten about. How about the legislature? Congress is half controlled by the Democrats and half by the Republicans. Republicans control the Senate until the 2020 elections, and they'll probably control again soon. The elected officials in this country sway back and forth between conservatives and liberals. Actual leftists, like Bernie Sanders or AOC, don't actually hold much power in the end. Instead, people like Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden do. They're not on the news all the time, but they're the ones who are actually in power, and they're not proposing any actual radical policies that right-wingers like to fuss over, like reparations or whatever. Okay, so we've got 2 of the 3 branches of government covered. How about the third one? Oh right, the Supreme Court, which is now majority conservative, has been for a while, and recently opted to overturn the Roe v. Wade decision decades after it was made, not least to mention what else they've been up to. If anything, the halls of power are occupied by knee-quaking moderate Democrats and increasingly radical right Republicans, not the other way around. Maybe we should watch out for a coming far-left backlash. So, the government is not controlled by the radical left. How about the military, which WhatIfAltHist also mentions as being increasingly leftist? First, there aren't any polls of US military officers or anything like that, so there's no way to actually determine whether or not the military is becoming more left-wing. But it's a fact that most US veterans are disproportionately Republican. If you go to the very top, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you'll find men like Mark Milley, who've been cast as far-left communists for the high crime and misdemeanor of disagreeing with the January 6th riot and defending classes which mention racism at West Point. Milley is as basically far left as Mitt Romney. The guy is not a leftist, and the military is not a leftist institution. How about corporations? If you go down a list of the largest employers in the United States, which include Walmart, Amazon, Starbucks, and so on, you'll find that companies use the facade of diversity and inclusion, but in actuality crack down on anything that actually helps workers, like higher wages and unions. Those things are actually leftist, not pamphlets on basic civility like not calling customers the N-word. There's a word for this: redwashing. These companies aren't actually left-wing, they're just pretending to be so customers don't boycott them. If you go on OpenSecrets.com, you'll find a great site documenting what corporations and super PACs give money to which candidates. If you look at Walmart, you'll see that the company has given tens of thousands of dollars to both Republicans and Democrats. Same thing for Amazon.com. This is because those companies wish to maintain their abusive practices by bribing politicians to not regulate them, i.e. to stay right-wing to moderate, not go to the left and increase regulation. If you look at the 2020 presidential campaign, you'll see that both Joe Biden and Donald Trump received literally hundreds of millions of dollars from corporations. Now, they vary a bit on who received what from whom, but in the end, the picture is the same. It's not an issue of Democrat versus Republican, but we the people versus the guys at the top. Now, it's true that Republicans are plunging farther and farther to the right. We'll talk more about that soon, but conservatives aren't being pushed by an increasingly extreme left wing or by the capture of all institutions in America by the left. They're marching to the right on their own accord, following their own path to the beat of their own drums. Next.
This has been the way the world has been since the 1960s, and people often don't realize how much of a shift it's been. Our society had a series of massive social shifts that occurred in the 1960s, which I think are on the same degree as the rise of Christianity, Islam, or a major world religion. This include trying to push for total male and female social equality, the decoupling of sex from baby making and leading to free love, the idea of complete racial and ethnic equality, that war is inherently immoral, as is empire building, that all people are equally intelligent and we just need better socializing to create a utopia. This is a big difference in the idea of equity or equal outcomes and equality or legal equality. The sheer demographic power of the baby boomer generation, which in Western countries grew up in the easiest era in history ever, as I talk about in this video, has meant that the 1960s cultural norms have been pushed ever since.
Okay, so I'm not going to waste my breath defending baby boomers, but it's worth pointing out that between now and the 1960s, we've had Ronald Reagan, the Bushes, and Trump, who are all more conservative than the mid-century Republicans like Eisenhower or Ford. But that's not the main issue with what he says. WhatIfAltHist literally condemns the left for promoting the idea that different races and ethnicities are completely equal. Does he disagree with that? Does he believe that different ethnicities aren't equal? Does he understand what his words mean? Either he's racist, whose definition is literally believing that some races are better than others, or he doesn't understand what the word equal means. Or maybe he does know what it means, and he's not a racist, but he's dog whistling to the alt-right guys in his audience. In any of those three cases, which are the only possible cases, the guy comes out looking real bad. Later on in the video, he is shocked that people call him a Nazi. I wonder why they do that. Okay, let's look at the second possibility, the one where he doesn't know what the word equal means. That seems like the likeliest, judging from the text that he puts up, which reads, "How can all ethnicities be equal if some have luckier geographies, histories, etc.? What does this even mean? Is he defining equality based off who has the biggest empires? Like Africa isn't equal to Europe because Africa didn't conquer Europe? I think that's what he means, because he condemns the left later on for saying that empires are bad. Like, the thing America was created to resist. So in his book, equal means who has won the most wars, but that's not what people mean by equal. People mean the inherent, innate quality of humanness in each and every person when they speak of equality. What the Declaration of Independence says. You can't measure human equality on the basis of who made the biggest empire 300 years ago. The fact that some groups had luckier geographies and histories proves the fact that you can't. the one sentence he writes down disproves itself. Is he talking about historical contribution, like Europe made the biggest contribution to world history? If that's the case, then he needs to say that and not equality, because no one is saying that Europe didn't conquer Africa, the Americas, and South Asia. They're saying that conquest doesn't prove superiority of value. That's what people are talking about. I know this because I have literally read the books that make this claim, and it's obvious that WhatIfAltHist spends his time instead reading German and French social Darwinists from a century ago. WhatIfAltHist is responding to nothing, and in his blind thrashing, he has only managed to smack himself right in the jaw. This claim of his is either racist, a grift, or clueless. It seems like the last one is most likely. Okay, he also says, and I'm not going to do that voice again, how can the sexes be equal if women need to have children and men have testosterone and need to be driven to impress women? Again, he doesn't understand what equality means. No one is saying that men and women are exactly the same. Feminism is full of people discussing how men are driven, often by their biology, to hierarchical positions of authority. But we're not chimpanzees in a zoo. We can use our rationality to observe the immoral things biology compels. There's a biological basis for rage-fueled murder, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't outlaw murder. Just because testosterone influences behavior doesn't mean that men and women can't both serve in positions of power, or whatever definition he's using for equality. I'd also like to point out that in this example, number 2, he raises biology to challenge equality between men and women, which raises the question what he means by etc. in number 3, which is about different races. Number 4 is covered by number 3, so let's rewind back to number 1. Every nation in the world is built off war. How can you just freeze borders? Imagine how broken the world would be if we did that in 1800. What does this even mean? That people should fight more wars? Generally speaking, wars are bad. Wars aren't heroic jousts between knights. If we're talking about the wars that change borders, we're talking about Nanking, the firebombing of Dresden, we're talking about Srebrenica, villages massacred by Sudanese militants, we're talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we're talking about the Nazi rampage through Eastern Europe, millions dead. Those are the wars that change borders. Wars are, for the most part, bad. Now some ends justify their means. National independence, defeating the Nazis, defending yourself. Those are good aims which can only really be accomplished through some bloodshed. But we can't eagerly plunge ourselves into bloodbaths. Sometimes history geeks like WhatIfAltHist are so obsessed with history they forget to take lessons from it and instead want to repeat it. And don't say that he's just saying we shouldn't be afraid to fight the Nazis. He condemned the left for promoting the idea, and I quote, that war's inherently immoral as is empire building. Name one good empire. You can't, because conquering people and subjugating them for your own self-gain is evil. What about the rest of the video? I'll skip through the next few minutes. He talks about how baby boomers are to blame for all of this. Whatever, fine. Next he says,
a reasonable person looks at the historic record and uses it to project the future, since the past is the only thing we have, and thus it's the best thing we have to understand the future. This isn't controversial in the sciences, but is in the social sciences and humanities. This is since leftists would like to project their religious view of infinite progress that will give them more power, or the moral arc of history. In effect, they are substituting a serious study in exchange for a fantasy.
To counter that, I'll point out the fact that just a few hundred years ago there were no major democracies and most people were serfs or slaves with zero rights across the whole planet. So there has been some progress. There are trends to history. Next he says,
however, the changes that have been made since the 60s presupposes a series of assumptions about the world that have never been tested or evaluated. Those that men and women can healthily have the same social roles, that the people pushing these agendas are wise and capable, that there are not long-standing reasons that different ethnicities have different results, that society's structure itself is evil.
I don't know what else to say besides that this is an empty-headed claim. We'll focus on the different ethnicities bit, since that's the one worth disproving again, because we already talked about this a few minutes ago. First, WhatIfAltHist has said elsewhere that slavery is a cancer on society. He mentioned that like a dozen times in his Rome video, which I also made a counter video to. Does he think that nationwide cancers can just disappear? Does he think that the United States, when it abolished slavery, suddenly became a utopia? I honestly don't know, because why else would he make these claims? The left wing understands that African American people are not as wealthy as white people. Those are the different results he mentions, right? How people are successful in life. That is the very premise of investing in black communities, which is a primary feature of the left's political agenda. The reason why affirmative action exists is to make sure that people don't suffer because of the lasting impact of slavery and discrimination and all the things that came after it. And plenty of things did come after slavery. You can't just erase the fact that nearly all African American people in this country had absolutely zero wealth just a few generations ago. Those who did try to build wealth were denied the opportunity to do so for the most part for another couple generations as well. The left doesn't ignore history, it understands the ongoing impact of it. Moving on.
Pushing this many changes upon a society this fast is not reform, it's suicide. And the people pushing this even say their goal is the complete destruction of the previous society. However, they fail to tell us what plans they have to replace it, only criticizing the previous culture. However, since their plan has no clear direction, we need them to lead us through this plan. This plan is exactly what the Soviet expert whose job was to destroy non-communist societies, Yuri Bezmenov, said the leftist scheme was.
Okay, so WhatIfAltHist is claiming that the left wing wants to destroy American society completely. As a citation, he turns to Yuri Bezmenov, a literal Soviet agent. Bezmenov, it's worth pointing out, wasn't some high-ranking guy in the USSR, he was a low-level propaganda editor who worked in India. The fact that WhatIfAltHist would sooner turn to a propagandist of the Soviet Union than read a left-wing book, that's pretty revealing, right? It's also true that the Communist Party of America wants to topple and revolutionize American society. That's true, but guess how many Americans are legitimate communists? Like actual communists, not communist LARPers. I'll give you a hint, it's basically nothing. Nobody, basically. We have 330 million people in this country, and communists make up a minuscule and irrelevant percentage. No, the left wing in this country is dominated by moderate dinosaurs like Joe Biden. The most extreme left-wing major politician in America is Bernie Sanders, a social democrat. None of those guys want to completely change American society at all whatsoever. Western Europe has elected many leaders more extreme than either of those two, and European society is still around. Social democrats don't want to overturn society, they want to help the working class. Calling Bernie Sanders a communist is like calling Marco Rubio a Nazi. Okay, so next he says that the left wing is making a big mistake by disagreeing with the Nazis too much. God forbid. That's it, that's my whole response to that claim, God forbid. Moving on.
The modern West hates men, its dominant ethnicities, tradition, force, and all that. However, the problem with building a coalition of everyone who wasn't part of the previous coalition of power is that it just doesn't make sense. There are often long-standing historic reasons why the dominant ethnic group, men and all that, are the ones in charge. If you have a country like America and you want it to function, you can't flagellate white people for practicality's sake since they're 3/4 of the population. Well, if we're being really brutal, America has flourished while being incredibly cruel to black people, which are only 12% of the population. The reason I went through that long segment earlier on trying to explain the left's worldview is that you can only understand how they are this bad at coalition building and having a coherent strategy through understanding how their worldview thinks having a completely idealistic scheme would work.
Okay, so the claim here is that the left-wing coalition is stupid because it won't last because it's made up of people who didn't make up the old coalition. If that's true, then the whole video is premised on an oxymoron, since the idea is that the left is so powerful that it controls all institutions in America, but if it's so powerful, then why is it so incompetent at the same time? He says that the left wing is alienating men and white people. This is a dumb point, because 45% of men voted for Joe Biden and 41% of white people did too. If the left hated white men so much, why are the two most powerful left-wing politicians in the United States Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, who are, by the way, white men? When you take the left wing to mean Twitter tankies, which is a small percent of actual people, obviously, you lose sense of the real world. You gotta look at the actual data. Okay, so WhatIfAltHist keeps talking about the supposed left-wing coalition for a while before diving into ethnic minorities. Here's what he says.
Let's take ethnic minorities. Asians and Hispanics largely want to assimilate into white America, and the track record for former slave black populations gaining power is Liberia and Haiti, both of which are failed states that practice slavery, largely since they gained none of the skills needed for leadership due to centuries of oppression.
Okay, so this is literally just the idea of systematic racism. The issue, though, is that he's using those ideas to argue, what? That black people can't be part of an effective governing coalition? That governments should just ignore black people? That's the only thing that could possibly connect criticizing the left for focusing on black people and then turning to talk about Haiti and Liberia. Obviously, this is a stupid point. If ex-enslaved people aren't doing well, the answer is to help them out and remove the burdens to their success. In America, that's the war on drugs, racist judicial decisions, and bad job opportunities in African American parts of the country. When it comes to Africa and Haiti, the answer is similar. It's addressing the lasting issues of colonization and economic exploitation by America and Europe. You can't just shrug aside those parts of the world, you also have to actively help them out. That's why foreign aid is a thing. Foreign investment is a good thing because, in the end, America gets some payoff at the end. Maybe we should do more of that before China does. Okay, let's look to see what WhatIfAltHist has to say about women.
For women, they're absolutely wonderful as individuals and a big reason to keep living as a man, and they also form the bedrock of society. However, women have absolutely no track record for forming large groups. All of society's major institutions, whether militaries, governments, religions, corporations, have been founded across world history and almost entirely staffed by men. Even nunneries and brothels, entirely female organizations, are run by men. If this was a cultural thing, not a biological, it would fluctuate around world history, but it doesn't. Due to never having to evolve to hunt as a group, women do not have the same instinct towards cooperation that men do. Most really pretty girls have been horribly bullied in high school, and most of their friends are guys, since women tear down successful or beautiful women, since their sexual competition is largely zero-sum, while men are sexually rewarded by being what amounts to successful hunters and bringing stuff for the whole community. Studies show women are just as aggressive as men, and they compete through relationships using something my friend Kurt Doolittle refers to as GSR, or gossiping, shaming, and rallying.
Alright, before we address all of this nonsense he just spluttered about women, it's first important to look at his citations, which form the basis of this whole argument, right? Who's Kurt Doolittle? Well, if you Google him, you'll pretty much find immediately what kind of person he is. Doolittle is a grifter and a freak who has made his career off of arguing that black people are genetically dumber. Here's him saying exactly that. If you see there, he calls the idea that all men are created equal and that intelligence is rooted in how good of an education you get, which is common sense, anti-Darwinian Marxist nonsense. Oh, and he's also anti-Semitic. Here's another tweet from him. Is there another Kurt Doolittle somewhere who uses the acronym GSR to psychoanalyze all women? Nope, that's him. This is what Kurt Doolittle tweets about that. Oh, and here's another one. In case you missed that, the guy's a Nazi, like Nazi garbage. He applies GSR not just to women, but to Jewish people. Obviously, Nazi trash. There's no other Kurt Doolittle who talks about this. That's him. This is who WhatIfAltHist cites, and not only that, calls a friend. If your only citation for an argument is a Nazi pile of putrid sludge, you're not making a good argument. Looking at who he cites for this video, maybe he actually means that different races aren't equal. It certainly seems that WhatIfAltHist can only manage to cite racist people. Then he wonders at the end of the video why people call him a Nazi. I'll summarize most of what WhatIfAltHist says about women. They can't run any major organizations because they're too catty or something. As evidence for this, he points out that no major military force has ever been majority women, as if men have such a great track record running militaries and avoiding civil wars. What does he think militaries do? It's a ridiculous claim to say that men are more cooperative, then in the same breath say that every war has been run by men. Obviously. The whole thing, in the end, is clearly a fallacy. The reason why only a few countries have, for example, majority women in parliament is because people hold the views he just described. He's mixing up which caused what. The majority of governments in history have not been majority women, that's true, but because people like WhatIfAltHist don't think they should be, so they didn't vote for them, or the government itself excluded women from the halls of power. This is what happens when you drop out of college and spend your days reading historians from early 1900s Europe. Your views are outdated by a century. Obviously, this should be enough for anybody who's not brainwashed to begin to question the whole video. If the book you're reading conveniently cites Adolf Hitler or something, then maybe you should, look at it with a grain of salt. Literally, looking at the rest of the video, he just does the same thing over and over again. Who does he cite to describe the supposed domination of America by left-wingers? He turns to this book, Leviathan and Its Enemies, written by Samuel T. Francis, a neo-Confederate racist and the leader of a hate group. It's not a coincidence. Let's keep fast-forwarding. He talks about how the leftist hegemony is going to enrage the radical right to take power. He's not looking forward to it, he says, but he also doesn't give any agency to the radical right, instead blaming the left wing for the backlash. How about we blame the people who actually do something? Next, he says that young men are adrift in Western society, which is a perfect catalyst for revolt. This is definitely true to some degree today. That's why grifters like Andrew Tate are so popular, as WhatIfAltHist points out. He also points out that young men increasingly have issues forming romantic relationships. This is part of a whole slew of social issues young people face today, including a lot of people not having any friends, being more sheltered and more risk averse. I'm not a social psychologist, but these sorts of things probably have something to do with the rise of the internet, social media, and the stratification of the economy, if I had to guess. Here's another clip I want to point out.
For some reference against the historic standard, in most cultures in the world, the young are married off at a young age by their parents, and the wives are basically slaves to their husbands. This isn't an especially good sexual orientation, but the fact that it's the historical and social norm around most of the world even today shows how keeping the number of sexually frustrated young men down and incentivizing them to work in society by having kids is so important. The sad truth is that women have been horribly oppressed by men over history, since societies are incentivized to sacrifice women to get men to work harder.
Okay, let's just rewind back to the map he just used, which supposedly depicts countries which have stable gender relations. Oh right, and here's a map of the world by political stability. If you're gonna argue that repressing women is a good pathway to a stable society, then why are all the countries with arranged marriages and repression of women so unstable, while the countries with women's rights are stable? Ultimately, I don't think WhatIfAltHist wants arranged marriages. But he also clearly thinks that women's rights have gone too far. Next, he goes back to Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, who we already talked about, but here's a gem too.
I'm often called a Nazi or far right, even though I'm one of the very few people in the public sphere who actually talks about how other cultures and anthropology works.
The reason people call WhatIfAltHist a Nazi or radical right-wing is because he cites Nazis and radical right-wing writers. Shouldn't that be obvious? Okay, the next part of the video just describes how young men are going to go farther and farther to the right, then use force to seize power. He theorizes about the different ideological segments of the new radical right-wing movement. Those are the emojis on the cover of the video. This is fine, whatever. It's not worth bickering over the details because it's all just armchair prophecy. It's certainly possible that young men in this country will go farther and farther to the right. That's a possibility. It might be true that the far right will go real crazy in the next few decades. Certainly, it's already halfway there. Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, who were moderate Republicans and on the 2012 presidential ticket, are now on the fringes of their own party. Liz Cheney, the chair of the House Republican Conference, was kicked out of the Wyoming Republican Party for criticizing Donald Trump. The main issue with WhatIfAltHist's prophecy is who he blames. He literally says,
left-wingers fail to realize that the only reason the far right would seize power is because of them.
This sort of thinking completely strips the right wing of this country of any agency. They're not being driven farther and farther to the right by the left. If the left wing was actually becoming radical, then wouldn't Barack Obama suddenly be the most moderate Democrat? Wouldn't Joe Biden, an old white guy, be shuffled quickly away like Paul Ryan? Wouldn't Nancy Pelosi be chased out of Washington like Liz Cheney? Wouldn't Alexander Soros or somebody be president? No, that's not the case. Trump and his ilk are gaining strength and power because the middle class is shrinking, because wealth and power in this country are increasingly held by men like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and not the rest of us, leaving us to fight over the scraps and the crumbs. Instead of pointing the blame upward where it belongs, people like Trump and WhatIfAltHist are gaining popularity by scapegoating leftists. WhatIfAltHist does mention these economic issues, he talks about them, but he says that they're the fault of the left wing, as if they weren't created in the first place by the neoliberalism of Ronald Reagan. WhatIfAltHist is pretending to sit on the sidelines, but he's the one who's saying that the country's going into the dumpster because of the left wing. You can't yell fire in a movie theater and get surprised when the firefighters show up. WhatIfAltHist is solidly giving himself the position of President Hindenburg on the eve of the rise to power of Adolf Hitler. The same exact pathway we're going on happened in Weimar Germany. Maybe we'll keep along that path. There's certainly some guys out there who could stab America real deep in the back. At the end of the video, WhatIfAltHist calls for the right wing not to go too crazy, not to go drunk with revenge and crash and burn the whole conservative enterprise. That is, after spending half the video riling them up about the danger of communist revolution. As I said before, conservatives need to find sensible, reasonable men to lead them, not scare them into a panic about some sort of left-wing, autocratic, social justice leviathan which controls everything. It's not the responsibility of the left to take care of the right. There's one last key point I want to emphasize though. Conservatives and liberals in this country want the same thing in the end. They want to live healthy, fulfilling, and complete lives. We're not truly enemies. If you talk to people you politically disagree with, you can understand that. If you stay in your bubble, you'll just drift farther and farther apart. It's not about the left versus the right, or liberals versus conservatives. It's about we the people versus the oligarchs in charge. If you like this video, subscribe, and if you want to be mentioned at the end of one of these tirades, check out my Patreon, and for $1 a month you can get your name in the closing credits. Thanks.